You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
So with the new year, often comes this kind of intent that I'm gonna do more this year. You know, I'm gonna be better about going to the gym, and I'm gonna make sure that I pack my day with everything that is meaningful and purposeful and not waste any more time like I did last year. This is the year that I'll, make a difference or whatever. That kind of fizzles out by right about now, the first weekend of the new year. And I'd rather just kind of take a nap and lay around and, catch up on some TV. But I'm never one for resolutions, but I do want to, try to pack in as much as I can in each day. We're going to go through the Gospel of Mark from now until Easter, and Mark kind of has the same sort of feeling about him when he writes his Gospel. It's the shortest Gospel that there is. You can probably read it in about an hour, but it does not let up. There is no filler here. Mark is trying to get as much in as he can, and as a result, we don't get much about like Christmas or anything like that. We go straight to the point of here's everything that Jesus is doing. To the point that if you were to only read Mark, you might suspect that Jesus' ministry was only like 9 months, about that much, instead of the 3 or so years that we had, because Mark is just really cramming everything in. So I want to read a big chunk of Mark chapter 1 to kind of give us this taste of how it's just moment after moment of Jesus on the move and doing stuff. This is going to be Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 45. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were all amazed, and they kept on asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once Jesus' fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. He came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening at sunset, they brought to him all who were sick and possessed by demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, he got up and went out to the deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. And when they found him, they said to him, "Everyone's searching for you." And Jesus answered, "Let us go into the neighboring towns so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do." And he went through all Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. A man with a skin disease came to him, begging him, and kneeling, he said to him, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." And moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I am willing. Be made clean." And immediately the skin disease left him, and he was made clean. After sternly warning him, he sent him away at once, saying to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them." But this guy went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the word, so that Jesus could no longer go into a town openly, but stayed out in the country, and people came to him from every quarter. And so you see we have in the morning, in the evening, and he was moving and nothing was stopping. He was just moving his way through this ministry. So right out of the gate, after Jesus gets baptized and calls his disciples, boom, we are on the road getting things done. And the first stop becomes a base camp for much of his ministry in Capernaum, home to a few of the disciples' family, namely Simon and Andrew, Simon later named Peter. And Jesus introduces himself to the religious community there at the synagogue with this new teaching via a sermon, only to be interrupted in the middle of it by this, demon-possessed person with an unclean spirit. So he stops his sermon, fixes that problem, and goes right back into preaching. Now, the weird thing is within Mark, we hear all about this new teaching with authority, but we don't hear what the teaching is. Luke fills in the blanks on that one. But for all this new teaching, we don't really find out any of the content of what this sermon was all about. Instead, what we're going to do is have a lot more show and not so much tell in the Gospel of Mark. We're going to be able to look at Jesus and see what he's doing, and in that seeing, understand what the message that he is sharing is. The way that Mark is going to set up this story, and one of the things that becomes sort of the fingerprint that Mark will leave on the story of Jesus, is that Jesus is the ideal human. He will say the Son of Man. It's sort of like an everyman, but not like the every common man, but what every person could be if they were fully devoted to the ways of God. And therefore, what we could become if we were to emulate and embody the way of Jesus. For Mark, Jesus is someone that we should follow, that we should seek to live that example in our own life. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone should start preaching and casting out demons. But I think that we can speak and act with authority, one that seems to be lacking among religious people, just as Jesus did. I think you know that for many people, religious language is an immediate turnoff. They don't want that, need that, desire that, want to hear it. And in fact, if you start up with it, it's probably because you're a bigot, or trying to trick them into something else, or just want their money. And so we have to be careful about how we might employ our own religious authority and language so that it embodies the way of Jesus. Because whatever Jesus is teaching, it's compellingly different than what most people at the time were hearing. And I think in part because the authority that Jesus uses is not one that shouts down his critics or cultivates fears of those who would listen, but instead of this because I said so authoritarianism, Jesus is one that embodies goodness, what the Bible will often call righteousness, this commitment to not being morally superior than everyone else. That's not the idea of righteousness. But the righteousness is one that sees wrongs and then seeks to make them right. To see people crippled by unclean spirits and releasing them from that. To see people dying of illness and bringing healing to that. To seeing people separated from their communities and reintegrating them into the life and love of one another. What we see throughout this chapter is Jesus healing both publicly and privately. In the middle of a synagogue with all the religious people around, and in the home of some close friends. Jesus' response to people, especially people in need, it almost feels like it's instinct from him, this immediate response to the plight of people. When there's a need, he responds. There's no hand-wringing or wondering how it will happen. And I think my natural response is often to say no. Like, do you want to go and hang out with some people tonight? No, I don't really want to. I've already spent my emotional energy and plans throughout the rest of my life that I don't want one more thing on my plate, And so, do you want to go see a play this weekend? No. Wait, you want to go out to dinner tonight? Not really. Do you want to just lay on the couch and not do anything? That sounds awesome. And I think it takes work to make room in our life to say yes. And it takes a lot of work to make room in our lives so that yes becomes our first impulse, especially for people who are in need. It takes practice to make it instinct. It takes discipline, and therefore to be a disciple of Christ is one to see how Jesus acts and responds to people in need and try to do it ourselves. To be a disciple is to open ourselves up to the opportunities to say yes, especially when people are suffering. Not just the yeses that can help us step up in the world, not just the yeses that give us more than what we've taken, but instead to make our lives an offering for those around us. When Jesus says yes to these opportunities, more come his way. By the evening, there's a crowd at the door. Jesus has become small town famous, and everybody who needs healing wants to be healed. I don't like Jesus' response here. Maybe you, when I was reading through it, also was like, Jesus, hold up, man. People were asking for healing, and you told the disciples it's time to leave and go somewhere else? You're leaving all these people sick behind while you go and get small town famous next door? But Jesus says in his time of prayer that it's time to move on to other towns and villages so that they too might come to know this message that brings with it healing and wholeness. Jesus becomes clear on his mission and proclaiming this message of renewal that comes with the kingdom of God. And I think some of us want to maybe react from saying no to everything well, I'm just going to say yes to everything. That'll make my life easier, right? No. What we find is that Jesus is very intent on knowing what it is he says yes to, because he's very clear on what his mission is. And this is a mission that he gives to each of us. That through the power and authority that God has granted us, the salvation and life that we have received, we are to give it away. That we are to become servants of those who would otherwise never know the kind of healing and grace and love that God has for them. And for some of us, that can be a wide audience, and for some of us, that's a very narrow band, but what we know is that we are each called to follow Jesus in that way. Because what Jesus doesn't do is take all those that he's healed from Capernaum and have them follow. Instead, he leaves them behind. Because I think his intent is that they now become the healers. He doesn't need to be there anymore because there are others who have been healed and who are capable of healing others. That Jesus is going to plant new gardens of life that could flourish in these places and leaving behind his Spirit that might then cultivate others. So it's important that we would receive this message in a way that would not read into this callousness that Jesus brings healing and then moves on because he's got a job to do. But instead that he's leaving life behind so that that life might continue to flourish. And that it's not just that, well, I got what I needed and that's all I need out of my faith, but instead our faith flourishes when we are willing to give it away. That our life flourishes when we are willing to give it away. Because I think it's at this point that Mark is intent on letting us see the heartbeat of Christ within these healings, that he's not moving so fast that he's ignoring the people he interacts with. Because at this point we meet a man with a skin disease, leprosy maybe, but something that is very transmissible, that on contact you're ruined. And then when Jesus sees this man who asks, Lord, if you were willing, I know you can heal me. We hear that Jesus is moved with compassion before he responds. And I think that that is the heartbeat of what Christ has done at every moment in this passage and throughout the Gospel of Mark, is that Jesus is moved with compassion, and by following that compassion, Jesus brings healing to people. And instead of merely speaking cleansing to this man, Mark says how Jesus touched him and said, I am willing, you are healed. And in that touch, Jesus breaks every health code guidance possible. Because what we find out is that while many people want to make us afraid of those who are beyond the faith, or for those who are not quite so put together, or for those who have their own doubts about who God is and God's role within their life, that there are many who would teach us to be afraid of them and to keep them out and away because they might infect us. They might pollute us. They might pass their disease on to us. And so it's best to ostracize and marginalize and oppress so that they don't change who we are. And what we find is that Jesus doesn't believe any of that. Because as disease might come one way, holiness travels the same way. And in this way, Jesus' righteousness and care and love is powerful enough to not only keep him from being sick, but also to bring healing to someone else. That our faith and our hope and our love are able to overcome any of the other things that we might feel could pollute our spiritual faith or the goodness of our life. And so we don't have to be afraid of whatever is out there. But instead, we can be bold and moved with compassion. Jesus will instruct this man to go to the priests, who will then name this man as ritually clean, and as a result of being ritually clean, can reintegrate into his community. Because it's important to understand that the healing that comes is not just a physical well-being that Jesus brings us, but Jesus brings us to one another. Jesus puts us back into relationship with one another. Jesus restores our place within the community so that the ones who are most marginalized might be brought back into the center. That's the power of what Christ's healing does to us, is it puts us in contact with one another. Beyond making the body healthy, we were reminded how we are made for one another. And so when we embrace God's mission, we find creative ways to mend what is broken. Creative ways to embrace those who have been excluded, to welcome those who have been called strangers, to know the names of those who would otherwise believe that their names are not even worth knowing. And that we can enter into these relationships without fear. Anybody else kind of scared of 2024? Anybody? I was at the grocery store on the 1st, picking up some more food for people, and the woman checking me out as I was buying everything, I said, "Happy New Year," and she was like, "I hope so. I hope it's happy." Because 2024 is an election year is what she told me. She didn't know what my thoughts were on politics. She didn't know if I was a safe person to talk to. I don't know what vibe I gave off that it was able to say, "I understand where you're coming from." But I guess I was giving it off that morning as I was rushing around. But I think that many communities in our nation and in our world are going to face political division, tests of what it means to be patriotic or to have community spirit or whatever. I think for many people, 2024 promises nothing but fear, division, separation. And there's a hope within us that maybe it doesn't have to be that way, but I'm not going to hedge my bets. And I think the power of starting the year in seeing Jesus teach, not just hearing the words that Jesus says, but seeing him do this work, is that we might come to understand our role within it. That in a world that is split down the middle through fear, where fears are riled up, so it becomes the fuel of how we move through this world, that we can come to announce peace. That we could be the ones to announce love and welcome. That those who would otherwise be shut out and whose voices would be dismissed might be heard and loved and cared for. What we find Jesus doing is once healing has come, he moves to the places where there still needs to be healing. Once life has been found, he moves into the places of death and sickness and division. He is not afraid, nor is he afraid to bring his followers with him in that endeavor. And so we are called to move to the margins and listen to the voiceless. What we find Jesus doing in this first chapter is difficult work that he doesn't stop. He keeps finding more hard work to do. He rests, he prays, he practices the Sabbath too. But I think many of us sense that this next year is going to be a long, difficult road to walk, and the work won't ever stop. So what do? Just roll over, give up? I got mine, and so I'm okay? I don't think so. For me, the season of Epiphany is one when we see the presence of God responding to the realities of our world. That we would see the gifts of God made aware in a way that we can't help but claim them. That they become more than just ideas, but they become actions and realities that we can grasp. And that's kind of the promise of a new year as well. That as much of it is as unknown, that we might, at this moment, be able to orient ourselves so that we might lay some control and claim over what happens these next several months. What we find in the opening parts of Mark's gospel is that God will see the sickness and the brokenness of the world and not settle for it. That God will see the illness and evils that exist and move into it so that it might be healed and eradicated. We start off the year because we want to do something, do more. And that's what God is doing here. That God is acting in a way, knowing that the work may never be done, and yet acting anyway. And so we need to be sustained in this work. And the way we find ourselves sustained in this work is the way that Jesus provides for his disciples. We will be opening the first Sunday of the year at a table that is designed to sustain us, at a meal that is made for us to find all the strength and peace that we would need to move into a place that would otherwise threaten who we are. That the body and blood of Christ, the bread and the cup, become an embodiment of a life that gives life away. And so I'd like us to consider how this place has become for us a place of healing. How this place is designed to be a place of healing. And that there are those beyond this place that also need this healing. That we might become sanctuaries for others. We might become a refuge for one another. We might become the very hands of Christ that would be moved with compassion and seek the blessing of others in the name of Christ. Amen.